Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We provide actionable investment ideas and timely market commentary to portfolio managers, hedge fund managers, family offices on a subscription basis. At Deep Knowledge Investing, we are particularly proud of our board of advisors. They are phenomenal experts in a wide range of fields. Today, we're going to be highlighting the knowledge of Dr. Soumi Eachempati. Dr. Eachempati was a professor of surgery and public health at Weill Cornell Medical College, chief of trauma and director of surgical ICU at New York Presbyterian Hospital, and president of the New York State chapter of the American College of Surgeons. He was on the board of governors of the American College of Surgeons, and following his successful surgical career, Dr. Eachempati worked as a biotechnology analyst at Point72 Asset Management. He's currently the CEO and co-founder of Chelsea Health Solutions and Cleared for Work, a digital health company focused on COVID-19. They are doing all the work required to help people safely get back to work. Most importantly, Dr. Eachempati volunteered as an ICU physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic in New York in April of 2020. He has extensive experience treating this disease, and he's on today to talk to us about COVID vaccines and therapies and what's being done to protect everyone. Dr. Eachempati, so glad to see you. Soumi, thanks for joining us. And whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear your thoughts on where everybody is regarding vaccine development and trials.
Sure, Gary. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. And thank you, Gary, for the honor of being on Deep Knowledge Investing as a board member. I know everyone on the call has a lot of different backgrounds, so I wanted to make sure that everyone kind of knew some of the basics of vaccines. I was going to spend a moment or two just saying that because so often people, especially investors, read the headline and the press release and the stock reaction and the commentary without knowing really what the bar was for vaccines. So a couple things need to be kept in mind. For every smallpox and polio vaccine, where they essentially eliminated those diseases and essentially conferred lifelong immunity, there are many other vaccine challenges that have been unmet. There is still not an HIV vaccine 25 years in. There is still not a common cold vaccine. There's still never been a vaccine done to a coronavirus-related vaccine. The closest has been to the MERS vaccine, which has had phase 1 success as of this year. And so it's just something to know that the vaccines, we are really in uncharted territory, having things go into phase 3 in the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, I should say, within 6 to 9 months. So that is completely uncharted territory. When you look at vaccines, what do you want out of the vaccines? So the main thing is, believe it or not something you give to everybody in the population right away, but at this level of the trials, the main thing is safety. So phase 1 is really a safety trial, and most vaccines usually have 50 to 100 people in a safety trial in a phase 1. And then in phase 2, you start thinking about efficacy, and that usually has another probably 0 attached to it, maybe 1 to 5,000, that kind of level. And phase 3 is another 0, 30,000 or so. I'm sure some of you have heard about the Russian vaccines. They kind of broke the rule, but that's the general rule for most of the vaccines that have ever been made. Safety, then efficacy, and by the FDA, effectiveness for approval by the FDA will be 50% effectiveness. They've already given guidance on that. What does 50% effectiveness mean? That means, say there's 10,000 people getting the vaccine, 10,000 getting placebo. Then what they do is, over a certain amount of time, and this varies, and the FDA controls this, is they say over 3 months, how many people in the placebo trial actually were beset with coronavirus, and how many people who got the vaccine had it. So you can do the math. If 100 people in the placebo group got coronavirus, that would mean 50 people or less in the vaccine group would have had to get it to have a 50% effectiveness. So you can see that's the bar. Now, they throw in a lot of other things in this press release, especially phase 1 and 2, and they are all immunological based issues that I have received so many questions with, and I'm sure you guys all want to know. so they make a big deal. Did this have neutralizing antibodies? Did this give T-cell immunity? What was the CD4 effectiveness? What was the CD8 effectiveness? The truth of the matter is these are all secondary endpoints which suggest effectiveness, but do not necessarily dictate effectiveness. None of these will be the bar for the FDA. The bar for the FDA will be that 50% effectiveness at decreasing the rate of COVID in the group. So yes, it's good to have neutralizing antibodies. Yes, it is good to have T-cell immunity and signs of CD4 and CD8 effectiveness, but those are not the necessary factor. People are using a lot of these surrogate data, and if you follow the stocks, people's stocks are moving on their proportion of neutralizing antibodies compared to the previous vaccine trial. So that's just some background. Gary, do you want me to talk about some of the individual vaccines, or how would you like me to go from there?
Actually, yes, I would love for you to update people on some of the more promising individual vaccine trials. People are interested both in where we stand from a public health point of view and also from an investment point of view. I just want to recap one thing that you just said. If I understand you right, the point that you're trying to convey is we don't have a magic bullet here. This isn't like you get a shot and you're immune. It's not like you said, smallpox, you have your vaccination, or tuberculosis, you don't get the disease. What they're looking for is something that would slow the spread of transmission and reduce the probability of getting the disease, more like a flu shot, where you'd be looking at maybe 20 to 60% effectiveness over 6 months, as opposed to a one-time cure or one-time you're protected for life.
Exactly. So, right. So Gary, everything you said is 100% right. And I can focus on a lot of the individual things, but let me go back to what you said originally, talk about some of the major vaccines. And again, I could honestly be filling this hour with each of the 5 major companies that have already had phase 1 data, but I'll just give you a very small nutshell, because I know that everyone has different degrees of interest in this and certainly ability to follow antibody levels. Because we all care about the big things, it's interesting that the big vaccine companies are really the big pharma companies. So Pfizer, J&J are the ones that immediately, and AstraZeneca are the ones that immediately come to mind. I can say 1 or 2 things about each of those. Pfizer didn't make a vaccine, but what they did was partner with a company called BioNTech in Europe, who was making a vaccine, and they actually did pretty well. And so I don't know how many of you read Stats News and Endpoints, which is really the biotech newsletter, but apparently the readership for this has gone through the roof since the coronavirus pandemic started. And so they actually listed their vaccine in terms of likelihood of success and importance, and Pfizer was number 1. Why was Pfizer number 1? Because a few things it put into place. One, it did show some benefit in phase 1. It did have some neutralizing antibodies. It is Pfizer, and it already got a contract from the government for a large number of vaccines, and it is Pfizer, and so they can actually recruit, so people don't realize one of the things of doing a vaccine trial is you have to recruit people, and it is hard for a little company to recruit people. They don't have tentacles in all these little hospitals, in all these big academic centers across the country and the world, in areas where there's hotspots of COVID. Pfizer and J&J and AstraZeneca have a network, so they already have inroads and investigators lined up and hospitals lined up, mature hospitals that have run clinical trials, can tabulate the data properly, and the big 3 or so will always be a step ahead. Plus, they have the resources to do due diligence and partner with what they think are the best candidates. So Pfizer is ahead. Their CEO has said publicly that results might be available for a subsequent trial in October, which could put their timeline getting an actual vaccine in the hands of clinicians by the end of the year. J&J is, I'll give you 1 or 2 points on that. The important point with the J&J vaccine is, opposed to the other ones, it's a single shot. Why is that important? Imagine it trying to inoculate, just in the US alone, 300 million people, 350 really, but 300 million people. Now try and do that with 2 shots. That makes it more than twice as hard, because a lot of people will fall through the cracks, not come back in 30 days, and also not get their secondary vaccine. So J&J, the fact that they have a single shot is already immensely beneficial. I've already done the math and thought about how many needles you need just to do the vaccines, And throughout the whole world, if you want to do 6 billion people, you need 6 billion new needles, alcohol swabs, and you can divide, nurses will do about 10 of these an hour. You know, you can do the math on how much person power is required to give these vaccines and all this, the secondary agents required. It's extraordinary. So just being able to give a single shot would really put a damper in COVID, actually. And so and you have to understand that a lot of people will have trouble scheduling the first shot, let alone the second shot. And so J&J is very important. Now, J&J is just starting their phase 1. They had good primate data, which was actually very good, but they have a huge manufacturing advantage. They have partnered with some great industrial corporations, and they are really strong in that way. The last thing I'll mention is just AstraZeneca. So they actually partnered with an Oxford company. AstraZeneca, for those who know, is based in England, so they were very involved in all the English research. And so a company in Oxford University, related with Oxford University, was working on a MERS vaccine. MERS is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which was a very deadly syndrome, much more deadly per case than coronavirus, having up to a 40% case fatality, but much less rare, thank goodness. Because that would just be, imagine what coronavirus did. If something with a 40% case fatality would just been extraordinarily problematic. But that's one of the reasons it doesn't spread to as many people, because people die and then they don't spread it. So, so they're actually a little bit ahead too. Their shortcoming was they didn't have the antibody titers, but they are actually ahead of the curve in terms of timeline, and again, might have something in October. So those are the big three that are ahead in terms of reach, scale, and they're related to the big companies. So I'll stop there for now.
All right, that's a great update regarding where we are. Again, we're looking at this both from issues of public health and safety and also investment opportunities. Going to some of the vaccines now, I'd love to get your thoughts on safety and unintended consequences. In general, vaccines have been a great thing for human health, but there have been some in the past that have proved to be dangerous. And whenever we do have some sort of COVID-19 vaccine, it's pretty clear it's going to be widely distributed before we have years of follow-up data. So what kind of concerns do you have about safety, unintended consequences? What could we be looking at a few years from now?
Sure. So for those who are old enough to remember, and we're on a call with everybody's kind of face muted out, et cetera. And so I'm not in an auditorium where I'm used to giving lectures and I can ask for a show of hands, but who remembers the 1976 election with Gerald Ford? This came on the heels of the swine flu pandemic that never was. But what happened is that he wanted the country to get mass inoculations from swine flu, which they thought would be that year's thing. And they actually vaccinated a lot of people. And then some public health, and Ford made a big photo op of being one of the first people to get vaccinated. And what happened then was public health people realized that there was 4 times higher the level of Guillain-Barré, a major neurologic illness, in the people who received the vaccine. They were never able to prove that the vaccine causes, but this was a debilitating neurologic disorder. And so that actually set the bar for vaccines in Western hemisphere anyway, much higher for proving safety. And that's why until this year, vaccines took 4 to 10 years to be approved, because people cared about long-term safety data, not just you gave a shot and did you have a fever that go away in 2 days. They cared about long-term safety data. And in all honesty, that is the long-term safety follow-up is being curtailed for the coronavirus vaccines, because we're not doing 3 to 5 year follow-ups of safety. We are going to be giving vaccines to Americans, Europeans, and the rest of the world with 6-month follow-up, 9-month follow-up in some people. And that is what society has chosen. Individuals can make their own choices, of course, but that is a concern. I'll anticipate your next question and say, if these big 3 or one of the other ones came up with a vaccine and they had good phase 3 data and the FDA approved them, where would I be in line? Would I be first in line, probably about 100,000th in line, or 100 millionth in line? And the truth of the matter is, after seeing it in 50,000 people, 30,000 people phase 1 trial, I would find being first in line. I should also say that I volunteered not only as a COVID doctor, which had its own set of threats. But I volunteered as a COVID vaccine person, and they didn't need me. So, but I did volunteer to get a vaccine. So now, if you want to know, I mean, the vaccine side effects currently, and I'm summarizing a lot of different vaccine trials, but in general, most of them are local effects and a couple fevers. Nobody's had fevers that lasted more than a week. And no one's had really, in most of these trials, have had fevers and disability that actually required hospitalization. So far, they have been considered fairly safe in terms of vaccine standards. They don't have long-term safety net, but I would be fine going first, knowing that the shot probably does hurt, especially the mRNA vaccines. That's the group like Moderna, where they actually give you the mRNA, and that makes the antigen to the virus that your body reacts to, and that is supposed to be very painful at the site. So yeah, but I would be fine getting the vaccine.
Soumi, thanks for addressing that. I know that it's become a bit of a political issue. It's a controversial issue. You know, who would get vaccinated and when, who'd have the opportunity, who's willing to take that risk. I think it's really interesting that you would be an early adopter. I think that's great information to get out there. On my end, again, I think vaccines have been phenomenal for public health in general. Personally, as an investor, I'm a little more risk averse. And I probably, from a personal point of view, would want to see maybe some additional follow-up data with larger samples of people before I would try it. I think one of the great things about deep knowledge investing is we encourage robust debate from people who have different points of view, and I'm really glad to get your point of view on there. Before I go to the next question, I just want a note for everybody who's on the call. If you have questions that you'd like to see or hear Dr. Eachempati respond to, please use the chat feature. You can send me a message and I will be happy to relay questions to him from any of you. If we're not covering something that really matters to you, if you have questions about specific trials or general health, COVID-19 related, of course, feel free to ping them in using the chat feature. Let me also ask you, Soumi, we're reading a lot about the issue of herd immunity, right? At what level of the population do you think need to be vaccinated to get to the point where we've really slowed the spread and this is no longer a pandemic, but rather something that people occasionally encounter?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. And it's interesting, and we've already talked about smallpox, but if you look at the smallpox research, the vaccine is only supposed to be giving antibodies 3 to 5 years. Now, we know there's no cases of smallpox essentially in the world today, aside in a lab. I mean, nobody humans infected with smallpox, which means herd immunity there got rid of all the smallpox in the 70s, even though the vaccine only lasted 3 to 5 years. So there is a certain level of herd immunity where enough people, so this is plausible, enough people can be vaccinated such that there is nobody to transmit the virus to anybody else, and the disease is essentially eliminated. Now, public health people say it's between 60 and 80% to get herd immunity. However, we all know that to get exposed to that, people live in little bubbles to a certain extent. And there are areas where you have much more contact with somebody else with the disease than somebody else. For example, if you're in a small town, the population of a small town is 10,000, nobody in the small town has it, you essentially have herd immunity in that town. Yes, you can get a visitor, somebody can drive through getting gas or going to the convenience store and give it. But the point is that in that you can get a lot of pockets of herd immunity rather than mass herd immunity. And so for pockets of herd immunity, I think that's probably in the 30 to 50% range. You don't need to have 80% of the people inoculated. The key is that you can't have a lot of migration. One of the things, we travel a lot, and one of the things I learned that I thought was fascinating is Easter Island. They had basically nobody had the flu, but then when all the Europeans came there in the early 1700s, something like a third of the population died out from the flu and diseases people brought. So, I mean, these are people, they had herd immunity and the reverse happened. So the migration actually caused, one of the downfalls of their society. So I think it's very important to realize that herd immunity is probably a lower number than people are quoting. The other thing you have to remember is the people who all had coronavirus antibodies and infections is not a zero number. In New York City, it's considered 20%. So if those people's antibodies are carried forward, then you need a lower number for total herd immunity, if you can follow that. So that there's functional herd immunity and there's absolute herd immunity, and people need to understand the distinction.
Right. There actually was an article out within the last couple of days where people have talked about needing about 70% to get to herd immunity. And the sense is that if you get 20% of the population vaccinated, you can get there. And the way they got that number was there's some evidence that one of the reasons we have such a large number of asymptomatic cases is people have a certain amount of T-cell immunity because they've been exposed to similar coronaviruses in the past. And so you take a 20% vaccination rate plus about a 50% sort of natural immunity, which is why we're seeing the lack of symptomatic cases in a lot of people. And it kind of gets you to a number where we have herd immunity. And what I find encouraging about that is we may not need to get 80, 90, 100% of people vaccinated. We may be able to do it depending on the overlap at around 20, 30%.
Right, and I think, and we haven't talked about it yet, but I think this is a good segue into talking about therapies. So we've talked about vaccines. I'm just going to say one little blurb. I know we're supposed to be focusing on vaccines, but therapies. So what you can do is start treating it like a disease and not a pandemic. So instead of the hospital being, having like Cornell was in April, 200 intubated patients with COVID, if you had just 5 people with COVID in the hospital, then you can start using the therapies that Regeneron and Lilly are working on. There's a couple other companies that are working on them that have had very good early success, and you treat the disease rather than the pandemic. And so if you knew that you were unlikely to get the disease, but if you were, you could have a treatable condition that doctors already had an answer for, and you would maybe be in the hospital a day or two and maybe feel sick for a little while, but you weren't having a high chance of dying, the 1% mortality or 80% early on, that happened in ICU patients, then you would feel a lot different about the disease, and you would not have the fear of going to ball games and restaurants and reintegrating society on all levels.
I totally agree. A curable disease is very different from something where you cross your fingers and hope you're not one of the,
right,
fortunately small number of people, but no one wants to be the statistic who gets hit hard. I promised people we'd keep this to half an hour. I'm down to my last 2 questions here. One, I want to highlight something for people that you and I have discussed in the past regarding concerns surrounding this fall's flu season, and specifically, this is something you and I have talked about, the G4 strain of H1N1, that we could be looking at a situation this fall where we have multiple diseases all with similar symptoms and trying to sort out the mess of what do you treat and how do we test and treat for which disease? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So this is really interesting. The CDC, on the site cdc.gov, I'm sure everybody knows that, releases press releases, whenever they think that things are an important public health issue. And everyone this year has been met with, it's probably the top trending topic of the day, except for one, the one on July 2nd, 2020, which could end up being the most important press release they had all year. And what it said was, it was saying, beware of the G4 strain of H1N1. Now, because it wasn't about COVID, no one paid attention to it. But what it is about is a new strain of H1N1 that has been documented in China. 2 Chinese workers had been infected. And what it basically is a swine flu strain that they have been following, public health people all over the world have been following for about the last 8 to 10 years. And the strain is now increasing to a level in pigs there that is getting concerning. One of the reasons that probably epidemiologists are yawning a little bit at it is 2 reasons. One is that COVID is such a bigger problem. And 2 is because it hasn't, besides not crossing into the US and have, like if somebody in Europe were found to have it, I mean, everyone would be panicking, but it's only been found in 2 humans. But the interesting thing that I did after doing research is that they did the local population who didn't work with pigs. and 4.4% of them had antibodies to this strain, which means that it probably went to some pig workers, but then also probably was transmitted into a fairly harmless virus, but then and went to other people. So it's just something to keep in mind that this is a potentially important strain. Why is that important? It goes back to what you said about this year's flu season. So if you had a second wave or a third wave of coronavirus in the fall, if you have the normal American flu season that it starts about October, and then you had another strain, even without the other strain of swine flu that could start to be a problem, you would really have a confounding disease problem. This would be a major health catastrophe in the United States because ERs are already strained in busy hospitals for flu season. I remember at Cornell in February, every ER bed was taken just with the flu before coronavirus. And if you had this problem with coronavirus, everybody wanted to be checked. You think testing is hard now, testing will be much harder back then. And because of spacing required for just quarantining people in ERs and hospitals and public health areas, if you actually had a much higher number with flu season and even with the G4 strain, that would be a major issue. So what I would think is, and I'm sure the CDC is going to start pushing this very soon, is that they will want everybody to get a flu vaccine this year to minimize the risk of false alarms of people having flu thinking they're having COVID. And we'll see if that actually works because, as you already have alluded to, this is not a good time for the people to get vaccines. This is the number of people scared of vaccines is at an all-time high. 33% of people have already said they're not getting the COVID vaccine in the first wave of giving. And people are already saying they don't want a flu vaccine. And so normally if 40 to 50% of people get flu vaccines and it's less, that will be a big problem in the United States and abroad.
Gotcha. Okay, Soumi, we're almost out of time here. One last key question. And this has been a hotly debated issue, but we keep hearing people say you can't get COVID-19 more than once. People have this idea that once they have it, they have immunity. My opinion on it is that there's quite a bit of evidence that says that's not the case. And as much as it's comforting to people to feel like they're now immune, they're kind of making up medical rules, which might make them feel better. But I don't know that that applies in reality. Do you have an opinion on this?
I have an opinion on it, but it's complicated, but I will paraphrase. Here's the opinion. So there's never been a documented case of somebody getting COVID more than once. Fact. However, there are people who test positive, test negative, and then a month later have tested positive. So what they think is the middle test may have been inaccurate and people have latent COVID in their, pharynx, et cetera, from a PCR standpoint. But I have to tell you, it is logical to get it more than once. Why do I say that? Because there are people with antibody titers they've checked, and after 3 months, they've come down to very close to negligible. So I would not predict that those would be protective anymore. And I think they could be susceptible to another COVID attack.
Great point. So your answer on that is not proven, but possible / likely.
Yes.
All right. Sounds good. Soumi, thank you so much for your time today, for all of your knowledge. And we're so glad to have you on the board of advisors for Deep Knowledge Investing. Anyone who's interested in this kind of investment related content, please reach out to me at Deep Knowledge Investing. And anyone who wants more information about getting your workforce back to work in an office or at a work site safely, please, I will help you contact Soumi at Chelsea Health Solutions and Cleared for Work. They're doing phenomenal work there that's going to be important. Thanks for joining us, and we're all set here.
Thank you, Gary.
Take care.